The rolling hills of eastern Kentucky shimmered like gold in the late 1800s, not because they held actual treasure, but because they were blanketed in vast fields of tobacco, swaying like waves under the southern sun. This was 1876, a time when tobacco wasn't just a crop, it was currency, culture, and power. In this golden age of southern agriculture, Beaumont Plantation stood as a crown jewel. Owned by Edgar Beaumont, the son of a French aristocrat who had fled political unrest in Europe, the plantation stretched across more than 2,000 acres of fertile land. The Beaumont family brought with them European elegance, an obsession with legacy, and, like many of their wealthy peers, a brutal reliance on labor. The plantation's success was legendary. Its tobacco leaves were considered among the finest in the South, purchased by factories in New York, London, and even Paris. Local farmers envied the Beaumonts. Their wealth bought everything: marble floors, chandeliers shipped from France, and even influence in Kentucky's political courts. But beneath the grandeur was something darker, something that whispered through the fields and haunted the workers' quarters. You see, the success of Beaumont wasn't built on innovation or divine blessing. It was built on exploitation, on the backs of those who had no voice and no choice. After the Civil War, slavery had legally ended, but in practice, the system had simply evolved. Now, freed black Americans, desperate Irish immigrants, and poor Appalachian whites became the backbone of the plantation workforce. They were promised wages, food, and shelter. What they got was backbreaking labor, poor living conditions, and a contract system that tied them to the land like chains with invisible links. Still, people came, because in 1876, for many, the Beaumont plantation represented the last hope. The country was reeling from the effects of Reconstruction. Industry hadn't yet reached rural Kentucky. There were no labor protections. Many towns had no schools, no hospitals, and when you were offered a job that included shelter and meals, even if it came with cruelty, you took it. So they came, families with nothing, widows, orphans, immigrants off boats. They came with calloused hands and heavy hearts, hoping the golden hills would give them something better than the broken valleys they left behind. And for a while they endured. They worked from sunup to sundown, fingers stained with tobacco resin, backs bent over rows that stretched farther than the eye could see. They endured overseers with whips. They endured silence, they endured hunger, because that's what survival looked like. But by 1876, something had shifted. The world outside was changing. There was talk of labor unions forming in northern cities. There were whispers among workers about fair pay, about Sunday rest, about schooling for children instead of work. Some began to ask questions, some began to write letters, and some, perhaps too boldly, began to organize. For Edgar Beaumont, a man obsessed with control and legacy, this was unforgivable. He believed the land spoke through him, that the tobacco fields existed to glorify his family name, and that any challenge to the order he had created was a threat not just to his business, but to the bloodline itself. He began to watch. He grew suspicious. He interrogated workers, fired those who spoke too freely, replaced supervisors with enforcers. Tension grew. Fear spread through the quarters. Families began sleeping with one eye open. Parents told their children not to speak around strangers, but still the unease remained. Then came the night of August 3rd, 1876. A full moon hung over the hills. The harvest was only days away. But when the sun rose the next morning, 41 workers were gone. Tools lay untouched, beds were still made, not a single soul knew or admitted to seeing anything. Edgar Beaumont said they fled. The sheriff didn't question it. No search parties were sent. No stories made the paper. It was as if they had never existed, but people noticed. A child's shoe left near the barn, a meal still warm in the communal kitchen, a dog waiting at a door that would never open again, and the fields. They no longer felt golden, they felt haunted. Years would pass, the hills would grow again, new workers would arrive, the Beaumonts would thrive. But the silence of those vanished 41 souls would linger like smoke in the rafters, like footprints in soil that refused to forget. And so the story begins. not just with the success of a plantation, but with the cost of that success, with a legacy built on labor, silence, and mystery. The golden hills of Kentucky shone bright in the sun. But beneath them, something darker was buried, and one day, someone would come looking. August 4th, 1876, began like any other harvest day on the Beaumont plantation, but something was wrong. The sun broke through the Kentucky mist, lighting up the golden fields, but there was no movement. No rustle of hoes in the earth, no chatter between rows, no call of morning roll. The field bosses stood stunned as they realized 41 workers were missing, not fired, not transferred, not dismissed. Gone, the strange part, there were no signs of struggle, no broken doors, no blood, no witnesses, no warnings. Their cabins were untouched, their few belongings still in place. Bibles, work boots, even Sunday clothes hung neatly on the backs of doors. The food in some kitchens was still warm. A few beds hadn't even been slept in. At first, Edgar Beaumont, the plantation's owner, called it a mass desertion. He issued a statement to the local authorities claiming the workers had abandoned their duties in the night. To the sheriff, it was a matter of wage dissatisfaction. To Edgar, it was treason, an insult to his name, his bloodline, and the land that had made him a powerful man. But to those who remained on the plantation, it was something far more chilling, because the workers who disappeared were the ones who had been speaking up, asking questions, whispers about long hours, about unpaid wages, about wanting a school for their children. Some were literate, dangerously so, in Edgar's eyes. Others had tried organizing informal meetings in the chapel at night. A few had even written to local pastors and politicians, begging for someone to intervene. Now they were gone just like that. Among the missing were James Tolley, a former Union soldier turned field foreman who had begun pushing for safer working conditions. Mee Hawkins, a widowed mother of 3, who had been teaching reading to the children in secret. Sean Delaney, an Irish immigrant who'd traveled hundreds of miles after hearing the Beaumont name promised steady work and decent wages. All vanished without trace, without justice. The remaining workers were paralyzed with fear. No one asked questions, no one stepped out of line. A quiet terror fell across the plantation like a morning fog that never lifted. Workers stopped gathering at night, conversations dried up, even the children stopped laughing. But the fear wasn't just born of silence, it was fueled by what came after. Strange things began happening in the weeks that followed. At night, some workers reported seeing shadows moving in the fields, long after sundown. One boy said he saw figures walking in the tobacco rows, even though no one was allowed out after dark. A mule was found tied to the post, dead of fright, its eyes wide, its mouth foaming. One elderly woman swore she heard screaming underground near the workers' quarters, though others dismissed it as a dream. Most people refused to speak about it. Some said it was the land, others blamed God. But deep down, many believed the truth was far more human, that those 41 souls didn't leave, they were taken, no search was conducted, no names printed, no graves found, and slowly, history moved on the kind of cruel silence only power can afford. But the families of the missing never forgot. Letters were sent to relatives back east, but responses never came. Some parents died waiting for news that never arrived. A few, too poor to leave, remained on the plantation, haunted not just by what they saw, but by what they didn't. In 1881, 5 years after the disappearance, a young woman named Caroline Tolley, daughter of James, returned to the plantation grounds as a maid under a new name. She spent 3 years quietly interviewing elderly workers, gathering fragments of memory, whispered testimonies, and half-remembered stories. She came to believe the missing 41 had not fled but were buried, somewhere deep beneath the fields, perhaps in a collapsed root cellar or in the unused cave behind the smokehouse that had since been sealed with stones. In her journals, she wrote, "There is no curse here, no haunting, just the weight of silence soaked into the soil. Their voices cry out every time the wind rustles through the leaves." But Caroline's findings never reached the public. In 1886, she too vanished, last seen boarding a carriage back toward Louisville. Her journals were discovered only decades later, tucked inside the walls of an old chapel room that had been used for plantation services. To this day, no trace of the 41 has been found. The official story remains abandonment. The Beaumont legacy still carries prestige in local records, but the workers who live in the area, whose great-grandparents toiled in those fields, remember differently. They say the land never forgets, and when the wind blows just right, you can hear them, 41 voices, moving with the tobacco leaves. By the turn of the century, the Beaumont plantation had changed little on the surface. The tobacco still grew high in summer, the fields remained fertile, and the wealthy families in neighboring counties still spoke of the Beaumont name with admiration. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. In 1903, a terrible storm rolled through Boone Hollow, flooding much of central Kentucky. Wind ripped shingles off cabins, trees fell. The soil, so carefully plowed and nurtured for tobacco, turned to sludge. In the chaos of cleanup, something unexpected surfaced: bones. A group of workers assigned to clear the western grove reported finding a skeletal hand sticking up through the roots of a collapsed chestnut tree near the edge of the oldest tobacco field. At first, they assumed it was the remains of an animal, but when more bones appeared, 2 femurs, a cracked skull, and then pieces of clothing still caught in the roots, panic began to spread. The foreman reported it to the plantation manager, who quickly ordered the site to be sealed and covered. He claimed it was a long-forgotten family burial plot, but the workers knew better. That part of the grove had no headstones, no records, and no family tales attached to it. It was simply untouched land, avoided for years without reason. Word spread quickly among the older workers, those whose fathers or grandfathers had whispered about the missing 41. Some now believed this grove was the final resting place, long speculated about but never confirmed. Others claimed to hear the cries of the lost souls whenever the wind moved through the trees. But perhaps the most disturbing clue was this: the tree that had fallen and revealed the bones. It had been planted in 1877, a year after the disappearances. And it wasn't alone. A dozen more trees lined the outer grove, all perfectly spaced, all roughly the same age, forming a circle around the suspected grave site. It no longer looked like a storm-blown accident. It looked like a cover-up. In secret, a group of young workers returned to the site one night with lanterns and tools. They dug through the mud and roots, pulling out fragments of fabric, pieces of boots, a broken rosary, even a rusted belt buckle. One boy, no older than 17, found a child's shoe buried near the edge. The men stopped. There were no children listed among the 41, but stories had circulated for years that 2 young sons had refused to leave their mothers during the vanishing. Now, that rumor felt painfully real. The plantation owners caught wind of the digging and reacted swiftly. Several workers were fired. The grove was fenced off and declared a private wildlife sanctuary. Hunting and trespassing were forbidden by law. New trees were planted, and guards were assigned during harvest season to ensure no one returned. But stories have a way of surviving. Over the next decades, the grave beneath the roots became legend. Children growing up nearby dared one another to sneak past the fence at night. Some claimed they saw glowing lights drifting between the trees. Others spoke of a soft humming sound, like a lullaby, echoing from deep underground. In 1958, Dr. Lillian Raines, a professor of history from the University of Kentucky, took a keen interest in the Beaumont mystery after finding Caroline Tolley's lost journals in a library archive. Caroline had written extensively about the possibility of a mass grave hidden within the plantation borders, and her final entry before her disappearance mentioned a ring of trees guarding their secret. Dr. Raines traveled to the plantation site, now partially abandoned and owned by a private trust. She took photos, interviewed locals, and collected stories. But when she formally requested permission to excavate the grove, the trust denied it, citing land preservation laws. Within a year, Dr. Raines' research was quietly shelved. Rumor has it she received an anonymous warning: the Beaumont name still holds weight, let the dead rest. And so, the grove still stands, lush, undisturbed, and hauntingly quiet. To this day, it is said that nothing grows well in that patch of land, crops rot early, animals refuse to linger, even the wind behaves strangely, either too still or howling when there's no storm, for those who believe it's sacred ground. For those who fear, it's cursed, but for those who remember the truth, it is a burial site without headstones, a grave not dug in ceremony, but in secrecy, a grave beneath the roots, holding the voices of 41 workers buried not just beneath the earth, but beneath a century of silence. In 1974, nearly a century after the mysterious disappearance of the 41 laborers, the old Beaumont Manor stood like a crumbling giant, elegant, forgotten, and draped in silence. Ivy curled around its columns. Its wooden floors moaned with every step. The plantation had been abandoned for over 2 decades by then, left to rot after a string of financial misfortunes and strange accidents that haunted the remaining heirs. That same year, a historical society from Lexington secured permission to inspect the estate. Their mission was simple, to document what remained of Kentucky's Gilded Age architecture, but they found more than warped beams and rotted velvet curtains. In the west wing behind the library's grand fireplace, a loose brick gave way during a routine inspection. At first, it looked like nothing, a crumbling corner of the wall half-eaten by time. But as one of the researchers pressed deeper, the panel behind it collapsed entirely, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small wooden chest, blackened with age and sealed with a rusted clasp. The team gathered around, gloves were slipped on, tools retrieved. They pried open the box. Within it lay a leather-bound ledger dated 1876, the year the workers vanished. Its pages were stiff, but the ink was preserved remarkably well. It wasn't a household journal or farming log, as they'd assumed. This was something else, something darker. The ledger detailed every financial transaction made on the plantation for that year, every supply order, every wage paid, and every name listed under labor contracts. But halfway through, it changed tone. The handwriting shifted and the entries became cryptic, frantic. On June 3rd, one entry read, "The workmen speak of shadows. They say the grove is cursed. We must quiet them before their fear spreads." By June 7th, another, "See, Tolly has begun writing letters to the church. She suspects too much. She must be kept away from the workers." The most chilling entry came on June 14th, the day the 41 disappeared. The page had been slashed across with a knife, but the words beneath could still be read. "Tonight they'll all be gone. No one will speak of it. The circle has been dug. Let the roots grow deep." At the bottom of the page was a signature, faded and trembling, T.C. Beaumont, Thomas Calhoun Beaumont, the last patriarch before the family line fractured. The discovery of the ledger sent shockwaves through the historical community. Here was proof, not just of a disappearance, but of a calculated erasure. The names of the 41 were listed, and next to each one was a mark. Not an X, and not a paid, but a simple red dot, as if to say, eliminated. The society attempted to go public with the find, but within weeks, their project was shut down. The land trust that owned the property revoked access, citing a breach of preservation protocol. Legal threats followed. The ledger vanished from public record, but one of the researchers, a young woman named Marian Elkins, had made copies. She hid them in plain sight, submitted them to various academic journals under the guise of fictional historical accounts. She also kept a detailed diary of her own experiences during the Beaumont visit. In her entries, she described a persistent feeling of being watched while on the estate, especially near the old grove. Once, she claimed to have heard whispering voices while reading the ledger out loud to a colleague. "The air turned cold," she wrote. "The pages shook in my hand, though there was no wind." Marian passed away in 2008. Her belongings, including the ledger copies, were donated to a local museum, but the ledger itself, the original, remains lost or, more accurately, hidden. Some believe the Beaumont Trust reclaimed it. Others say it was destroyed to prevent further scandal, and yet, even without the original book, the damage was done. The truth had surfaced, if only for a moment. The plantation was no longer just a symbol of Kentucky's tobacco wealth. It was now a crime scene sealed by time. The ledger revealed something even more sinister than a disappearance. It revealed intent. These 41 laborers were not lost in an accident. They weren't swept away by disease or revolt. They were silenced systematically, deliberately, and buried both in earth and in history. The wall that hid the ledger for nearly 100 years did more than protect a secret. It became a metaphor, a reminder of how wealth and power can build walls around truth, and how sometimes it takes the decay of time to crack them open. But the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. And now the names are known. The ledger in the wall may be buried again, but its ghost, like the 41 missing workers, refuses to rest. The fog was thick that morning, rolling over the Kentucky hills like a white shroud, covering the valley where the Beaumont plantation once reigned. But despite the weather, a crowd had gathered. Some were historians, others were descendants of sharecroppers, activists, local reporters, and quiet witnesses to a long-suppressed truth. They came not for spectacle, but for remembrance. It was August 14th, 2023, exactly 147 years since the 41 plantation workers disappeared without a trace. For the first time, the town of Ash Valley, once silent on the matter, had publicly acknowledged the event. And more importantly, they were ready to say their names. This was the day the people called the Day of Names, a grassroots movement born from a whisper of history and turned into a roar of reckoning. The idea was sparked by a local high school history teacher, David Selwyn, who had stumbled across Marion Elkin's journal in the Lexington Museum archives. After verifying the references to the missing ledger and reviewing the documented list of the 41 workers, David knew he had to do something more than teach the story. He had to correct the record. With the help of volunteers, he petitioned the town council to designate a historical landmark on the plantation grounds. The Beaumont estate had long since collapsed into ruin, swallowed by vines and oak. But the earth remembered. Beneath it lay untold secrets. Bones, perhaps, and stories waiting to breathe again. A single oak tree still stood near the edge of the former workers' quarters. Towering, ancient, defiant, it became the sacred place for the ceremony. At its base was now a stone plaque, newly installed, not ornate but honest. Chiseled into the granite were 41 names, and at 900 A.M., the first name was read aloud: Isaiah Bell, age 32, field foreman, husband, father of 4. Then came the next: Martha Green, age 19, tobacco picker, sister, daughter, dreamer. Then another and another. The names stretched across class and color. Black, white, Irish immigrants, formerly enslaved people working for meager wages, widows, orphans, laborers, all voiceless victims of a system that chose profit over people and legacy over truth. People in the crowd held candles. Some wept, others stood still, fists clenched or heads bowed. One woman, Clarice Dupree, stood closest to the stone. She wore a faded locket that had belonged to her great-grandmother. A woman she had only recently discovered was on that list. For decades, Clarice's family believed their ancestor had run off. That's what the stories said. She left and never came back. But now Clarice knew the truth. She never left. She had been erased. As the names concluded, David stepped forward. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. His voice trembled, but not from fear, from conviction. These names were hidden for nearly 150 years, buried behind brick and sealed with silence, but history doesn't die. It waits for truth to rise, for courage to speak, for justice, even if long delayed, to finally arrive. Today, we are not here for guilt. We are here for acknowledgement, for remembrance, and for restoration. Applause wasn't the goal, but it came anyway. Then came a moment no one expected. An elderly man stepped forward, Edward Beaumont, the last surviving heir of the once mighty Beaumont line. He walked with a cane and heavy breath, but he spoke clearly. My family built wealth on this land, but it was never ours alone. The people whose names you read today, they built this too. They labored, suffered, and vanished in silence. I can't undo what's been done, but I stand here to say we were wrong to forget them, and we are better for remembering them. The hush that followed was heavy, sacred. After the ceremony, the townspeople were invited to place flowers, stones, or handwritten notes around the plaque. One child placed a single sunflower. Another man brought a harmonica and played a soft blues hymn. And just as the fog began to lift, sunlight broke through the clouds and bathed the grove in gold. It felt to many like the earth was breathing again. The Day of Names marked not just a ceremony, but a turning point. It reminded everyone that history is not just found in books or museums. It lives in the bones of the forgotten, in the pages we almost didn't read, in the stories we choose to uncover, and most of all, in the names we dare to speak. Because remembering is not just an act of history, it is an act of justice. And for the 41 souls who once worked the golden fields of Kentucky, their story was no longer buried. It had finally come home. The whispers of the past don't disappear. They echo, waiting for someone to hear. And in Ash Valley, Kentucky, that echo has finally turned into a legacy not of silence, but of truth. The Beaumont family name once stood as a symbol of Southern pride, wealth, and tradition. The plantation's vast tobacco fields were known for feeding the state's economy and the family's vanity. Their riches adorned halls with marble, filled ledgers with profits, and built generations of privilege. But underneath that legacy, hidden beneath polished floors and polished reputations, lay a truth that could no longer be ignored. That truth came back in the form of 41 missing names and a community no longer willing to turn away. When the final name was etched into the memorial stone and spoken aloud during the Day of Names, something subtle but powerful shifted. The Beaumont name, once untouchable, became human, not condemned, not glorified, just seen honestly. The story of the missing workers had rewritten everything, and in doing so, rewrote the idea of legacy itself. A town awakens. The events of the plantation were no longer just history. They had become a movement. Schools in Ash Valley began integrating the full story of the Beaumont workers into their local curriculum. Instead of glorifying the plantation as a symbol of regional pride, they taught it as a complex reminder that prosperity built on pain always leaves a price behind. Teachers brought students to the memorial to teach them the names, not just the dates. Every April, the town now holds a walk of remembrance through what was once the Beaumont property. The fields that once saw the toil and vanishing of 41 souls are now lined with sunflower beds, each labeled with one of the names from the ledger. What was once a symbol of oppression has become a garden of memory. Local artists began painting murals across downtown. One featured a line of tobacco pickers standing together, holding hands, each face distinct, powerful, proud. At the end of the line stood a woman with her arms outstretched to the sky. Beneath her, painted in bold, "We were never lost, you just weren't looking." Healing generations for the descendants of the 41 workers, the rewriting of the Beaumont legacy has meant something far deeper than historical correction. It has meant personal healing. People like Clarice Dupree, whose great-great-grandmother Martha was thought to have run off, now had the truth that had eluded her family for generations. It gave her the strength to forgive, not forget, but forgive, the lies that had filled in the void where truth should have lived. For Edward Beaumont, the aging heir, the rewriting of his family's history became a form of redemption. He donated the remaining Beaumont land to the town, stipulating that it be preserved as an educational heritage site. The mansion, what little remained of it, was stabilized and open to the public. But instead of velvet ropes and glossy brochures, the rooms tell the unvarnished story of power, of erasure, of complicity, and ultimately of reckoning. A placard inside reads, "This house stood tall while truth lay buried. Today, both stand side by side." A legacy worth passing on. Legacy is often misunderstood. It's not just the wealth we leave or the stories we tell. It's the truth we're willing to face. The Beaumont legacy is no longer defined by the grandeur of a tobacco empire, but by a town that chose truth over pride, courage over comfort, and healing over hiding. What began as a dark tale of 41 missing souls turned into a beacon for justice. Not courtroom justice, not revenge, but generational justice, the kind that lets ancestors finally rest and descendants finally rise. It showed people across the state, and even the country, that we don't have to be afraid of the past. We just have to be honest about it. The final line near the sunflower fields where the workers' quarters once stood, a new bench rests under the shadow of the old oak tree. Carved into it are just 8 words: we are what we remember and what we restore. Children now sit there on field trips. Elders come there to weep. Activists gather to tell new stories, and above them the wind whistles softly through the trees, as if the earth itself finally exhaled. The Beaumont legacy has been rewritten, not to erase the past, but to restore the voices it tried to silence, not to shame the living, but to honor the dead, not to destroy, but to begin again with truth.